Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Critical Conversations, where we discuss hot topic issues related to the Muslim world. Today we will focus our discussion on Islam Berg, a small community of Muslims, mostly African Americans, in upstate New York. Last year it made headlines when Robert Doggart, a former congressional candidate from Tennessee, threatened to attack it. According to FBI wiretaps, he assembled weapons and a 9-person militia to annihilate the community, but was arrested before he could do any damage. Today we will learn more about this case by talking to Tahirah Amatul-Wadud, legal counsel for Islam Berg. Ms. Amatul-Wadud is a licensed attorney who runs her own law practice with focus areas in civil rights and domestic relations law. Ms. Amatul-Wadud is a commissioner on the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women and has served on boards for Western Massachusetts nonprofit organizations. She was a White House invitee December 2015, attending a ceremony entitled Celebrating and Protecting America's Tradition of Religious Pluralism, where the community program Know Your Neighbor was launched. Tahirah, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to the program. So before we get into the details of the case surrounding Islam Berg, can you tell us a little bit more about the Islam Berg community itself, how it was founded, and how it's evolved over the years?
Yes, so Islam Berg is located upstate New York. It's 45 miles southeast of Binghamton, and Binghamton is home to the University of Binghamton, which is under the SUNY system, big university up there, and it's located in Hancock, New York. So Islam Berg is in a rural area, so it's off of Route 17, and if you turn on to the rural road that leads up to Islam Berg, you will pass other folks and families that live off of the road and drive a few miles in, and finally you'll get to sort of an enclave on the road that consists of 32 acres, by some count 62 acres of property, and that little hamlet is considered Islam Berg. There's a couple of dozen families there, and Islam Berg was purchased in 1984 by a community of Muslims who were established in East New York, most of them African American, most of them having converted from some other form of Christianity. Those individuals at that time are now in their 60s or 70s. So at that time they were in their 30s or 40s and had children. In my generation were their children. And they had just made the decision that living in the inner city of Brooklyn was not going to be a way to sustain their goal of being able to raise their children. And they were also very committed to trying to learn the religion of Islam, and they wanted to learn how to practice it in a Sunni Orthodox form, and it just was going to be very difficult to continue to do that in the community in which they were living.
Sure.
And they received some guidance from an imam who was from Pakistan, who came and gave them some guidance as to how to do that and encouraged them, because they were already a marginalized population, to remove themselves from the perils of the inner city. And that's how Islam Berg was founded. And I have pictures of Islam Berg when it was just a couple of trees and a house. And so it has evolved quite beautifully over the past 35 years.
Absolutely. And so did you visit Islam Berg while you were growing up as a child? Do you have family connections there?
Yes, certainly. So most of the families went to Islam Berg. Some purchased property in South Carolina. Others came to other areas, more suburban. And so my family and maybe 2 or 3 other families came to Western Massachusetts. But we have close friends and family who lived in Islam Berg and who lived in South Carolina. So we go to Islam Berg quite frequently for celebrations, weddings, and retreats and camps. So yes, Islam Berg has always been a significant part of my life, even 3 hours away.
Sure. And so, since its founding, and I think especially over the past 2 decades, it's been subject to so much scrutiny and so many conspiracy theories about the community, what it stands for. It's been accused of having training, terrorist camps and things like that. Why do you think it's been subject to so much suspicion? Mostly by right-wing groups. And so what are some of the causes of that, do you think?
I believe that some of the suspicion could just be natural curiosity, which is one thing. But actually what Islam Berg has been the target of has been a hateful campaign. And that's very different. I mean, it's okay to wonder, okay, well, this is an interesting community, not unlike some of the other religious communities that you hear about, especially in areas like the Catskills and Pennsylvania, where you have the Amish, where people seem to be fascinated by the Amish and they learn about them. But for some reason, Islam Berg has been ascribed with this horrible negative connotation, but that's been a deliberate campaign from people who look to sort of vilify individuals, particularly Muslims. And so what we've done, and for years, and as I have come up in my experience as a professional, is sort of we've written letters, we've tried to counter some of the myths. We've worked very closely with law enforcement. We've been transparent. We have neighbors who will come to the community and do whatever, engage in activities, celebrate weddings with us and with the community. And for some reason, it seemed still not to really turn the tide of these folks throughout the country who insisted on vilifying the community. And so we had to take some very bold action against at least one of the most vocal of those Islamophobes. And we sued them in federal court upstate New York, which is why I'm licensed in New York, the federal court, in a defamation case, because there was a couple of elements to what was happening in this hateful campaign. One, it was false. Two, it was dangerous.
Right.
And it needed to be checked, and that's what we did by filing the case. Ultimately, the case got dismissed because of some technicality, but what we did was we brought to light what was happening, and we challenged the government to aid us in setting the record straight, because it was hard doing it by ourselves with law enforcement kind of saying, you guys are okay, you guys are okay. They needed to be more visible.
Right.
And that lawsuit sort of had some collateral benefits for us in that from it, a lot of our claims were substantiated by law enforcement in other documents that got released within the 2 years following the filing of that lawsuit.
Sure. And so what are sort of Islam Berg's relations with other members of the larger sort of upstate New York community or closer to Hancock? I mean, is it well integrated? Is it more sort of isolated? How are those relations?
For the most part, what's the only aspect of Islam Berg that's somewhat secluded is that people live and sleep and worship there.
Right.
But those individuals go to school in the surrounding areas, in all of the community colleges in those counties. And there's maybe 3 or 4 with a 45-minute radius, and the universities. The children play youth sports in the area. So in those rural towns, Hancock and Deposit, you will see Muslim children integrated with children of other faith as basketball players, soccer players, football players, and you have and people who are employed. We have nurse practitioners, we have doctors, we have lawyers who have solid relationships and who have always had solid relationships with the individuals in the immediate towns and the further out towns going into Binghamton. So if the community was able to self-sustain and never have to leave the property, that would be one thing, but that was never the goal of Islam Berg, and it's not how it's manifested itself. And I don't ever foresee that it will ever become a community that is so secluded and isolated that it can't give back to the greater community. That's absolutely not the intention of what Islam Berg is supposed to be.
Absolutely. And you know, it's when you go on the internet, and recently Islam Berg got a lot of coverage because of various instances that we're going to sort of talk about in a little bit more detail. But if you go on the internet and you look up Islam Berg, there's all kinds of slanderous accusations against it. How do you counter some of that? And you sort of brought up the defamation suit that you had been involved with. But I mean, but for somebody who doesn't know anything about Islam Berg and sort of looks it up on Google, you know, they'll come up with all of these videos, very sort of ominous, sort of, you know, sinister videos and stuff. So how do you counter some of that?
Some of those videos actually were produced in the course of discovery in our lawsuit. And what a shame that these folks would put up videos where you could look at the topography and know that that is nowhere near the Northeast region of the United States.
Wow.
That is some bizarre desert with folks who are cloaked in garments that you don't see here in this country, and with a climate that is clearly not Islam Berg, and then they superimpose Islam Berg terror training camp. It's actually laughable, and it would be laughable if it wasn't so damaging. Because if you're a passive viewer who's sensitive to just receiving as opposed to challenging what you see, then you believe that Islam Berg is a desert and people are flying from trees doing drills. And that's highly unfair. And so we really challenged that. And we had to start challenging people to think critically about what it is that they're seeing. Why on earth would the government just allow a terror training camp to exist? You have law enforcement who comes to the properties pretty regularly.
Right.
If they saw bunkers, wouldn't they have shut them down? Wouldn't they have said something? And again, since 1984, there's been zero problem with Islam Berg. What on earth would motivate anybody to start problems now?
Right.
But these are the critical questions that people have to ask themselves. And they have to come outside of that comfort level of just receiving the information or seeing the articles on the internet and believing, well, could there be truth to this? Well,
And local law enforcement officials have come out and have been on record over and over again saying that we have great relations with the community.
Yes.
We've visited them a number of times and we've had no issues. But it's really great for you to sort of, clarify those videos as well, just because, again, as you said, passive receivers of that information are going to pretty much believe it.
definitely. And that's what's happening. That's
Right.
exactly what's happening.
So let's get to the specifics of this case surrounding Islam Berg and Robert Doggart. Can you tell us who is Robert Doggart? Why did he threaten Islam Berg? And why did the community hire you as their legal counsel?
So Robert Doggart is sort of an avowed anti-Muslim mouthpiece, and it goes beyond just Islam Berg. If you look at some of his older Facebook postings, he had insane extremist theories. He was holding rallies against Muslims, and he hated the president of the United States and thought that he should be killed. So he already came with his own agenda and his own set of issues before Islam Berg entered his life. He also ran for Congress in one of the congressional districts in Tennessee in 2014, and he lost. But he boasts that he got 6,000 votes. So he claims that he became interested in Islam Berg after watching Fox News. So what we like to say is, where was he radicalized? According to him, in some documents he submitted in support of his plea deal, which he ultimately reached with the FBI, which was later rejected. He submitted some documents indicating that he had been watching Fox News. Now, I'm not letting him off the hook that quickly because some of what he had done occurred before this particular episode of Fox News. But the fact that he aligns himself with publications like that says to me that people need to be careful about what they watch. And in a particular episode that he saw, it was actually a show which a speaker named Wayne Simmons was on. And Wayne Simmons is a fraud. He's been since discovered to have been a fraud. He perpetrated himself as being a former CIA agent, and he would go on these news circuits as a terrorism expert based on his being in the CIA, which the CIA also thought he was a CIA agent because they later hired him as a contracted employee and found out that he lied. So he pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. But one of the things he said in this particular episode was that Islam Berg was a terror training compound. And Robert Doggart felt that he needed to say that in one of his pleadings. He had gone to some of the communities in the South where some Muslims of America residents live, and he said, oh, you're fine. They're peaceful. He put on his Facebook page, there's nothing here. I'm going to go and continue my recon in New York. Wow. And I'm confident that had he come to New York, not that I'm inviting him to, but had he come to New York, he would have saw the same peaceful, laid-back, non-threatening environment. But he wasn't planning to come to New York to do just recon. He was coming to torch the mosque, kill the children, and engage in hand-to-hand combat. And all of that was intercepted by the FBI, and it was shut down in April of 2015, thankfully.
Absolutely. And so do you think, but then why did Islam Berg hire you?
Because the community is a primarily working class community, not wealthy at all. And every single thing that we do is a volunteer force. And because I'm a part of this community, these are my friends, this is my family, it was a natural task for me to take on. And I run my own law practice.
But what are you litigating? I mean, what's the case about? I mean, because of what Doggett was accused of doing, and you felt like he was let off too easily?
Yes. So there are two cases. There's the criminal case where I've been involved with another Tahirah Clark. We're both lawyers with the same first name, and we represent the community in the criminal cases, plural, because there were two named defendants, as interested victims. But because we don't have standing in the courts that those cases are pending in, we have limited ability to actually do much. So then in March of this year, we filed a civil rights case against Robert Doggett and his co-defendant, William Tint. That case is filed upstate New York. It's a civil case, and that was something that we had done in consultation with the community, in consultation with other civil rights groups in the United States who thought that this was a very good tool to use. And that case is on track. So we have a hearing in August. It was originally in July, but it's now been changed to August because the defendants were delayed in submitting an answer, but have communicated to the court that they do want to be heard. So that's going to be very interesting.
So you're advocating, so you're pushing for exactly what?
So in the civil case where we are in the driver's seat, we're seeking an injunction against the two named defendants from ever coming near any of the Muslim properties with 300 yards, or conspiring or encouraging or inciting any other individuals to do so. That's very important because Doggett had 9, as you had mentioned, 9 co-conspirators who have yet been identified to us, so we don't know who they are. And there's a dark, deep underground, a dark, deep hatred of Muslims in this country. So we have to be very careful and think not just about the guy that we caught, but about the guy that we haven't caught, we being the overall government, the public.
Yes.
And so we are asking this court to restrain these two individuals from inciting, orchestrating any of their friends from doing anything to this community, and as well as help pay some legal costs associated with the work that we've put in, and compensation, which is allowed. It's nominal. It's a nominal amount of compensation which you can get under this particular statute. Sure. But for us, the reassurance of their not being able to come anywhere near us is the most important.
Absolutely. So you mentioned Robert Doggett, he had assembled a 9-member sort of militia, and they were going to planning this attack. But I mean, how do you see Robert Doggett and his sort of co-conspirators in this? Do they belong to a fringe element in society, or are they connected to a larger network? And what are some of the relations between this group and other right-wing groups? And do you feel like the current climate sort of, provides sort of fertile ground for these kinds of acts?
I do believe that you find more and more right-wing extremists becoming radicalized, and there's no other way to categorize these folks other than radicalized. I'm assuming at some point in their life they were normal individuals, but I think with the constant barrage of hate that they are hearing, the sort of the normalization of hatred toward Muslims, I think that sometimes something just clicks in their mind, and either it feeds on a pre-existing hatred or a prejudice that they may have had, or it helps to develop one. And so you see these individuals who are sprouting up from throughout the country doing this. He's not the only one. How connected is he to some of these others? I don't know. That remains to be seen. But perhaps in the course of the discovery and an investigative stage of our case, we'll find out. Our philosophy when we had the defamation case was that there was a web. And what we had been uncovering at the time the case ended up being dismissed was that there was a small yet powerful, well-funded vocal minority, and it was a web of people. It wasn't the entire world who felt this way, but they would have you think it because they were highly effective shooting out this Islamophobic propaganda, and in many different highly effective ways.
Right. And so, I mean, since 9/11 and sort of domestic terrorism here in the U.S., law enforcement agencies, both federal and state, have really focused on Muslim communities and sort of instituting counter-radicalization programs and sort of trying to find community-based solutions to that. How do you counter the radicalization that's taking place then within right-wing groups? And what would you recommend? I mean, how do you sort of counter or combat this mindset that can ultimately become quite dangerous?
Right. I have the belief that the government, the federal government, the Department of Justice, state agencies have already acknowledged that the greatest security threat to this country is the extreme right wing. And that's supported by evidence-based data. It's not just anecdotal. It's not just me saying it. So if the government has already acknowledged that, then there has to be this, I believe, this public education push to let people know what the greatest threat is. And we always want to talk about if you see something, say something, but usually you associate that sort of mantra towards looking at Muslim communities.
Right.
But we need to be able to look at that which the government has already established is the greatest threat.
Sure.
Because if we don't focus on those communities, attacks happen. Thankfully, Robert Doggett was already on the radar for the law enforcers who intercepted that. But what about Dylan Roof? Why wasn't that intercepted? That was an extreme right-wing domestic terror event. The abortion clinics that were bombed and killed, people killed in October of 2015, another such incident. And almost every month there's something of that nature. So we have to sort of change.
And a lot of these are religiously motivated.
They are,
well, right?
And that sometimes gets suppressed in the media. The abortion clinic guy, he quoted some religious sentiment in carrying out his crime.
Sure.
But that doesn't get the attention that it gets, so that the American public can really just chew on that and know for themselves what's happening.
Right, and often these cases are sort of described as, or these individuals are described as having mental health issues. But I mean, I would argue that anybody who perpetrates any kind of criminal act or terrorism is, of course, they're subject to some kind of mental health issue, perhaps. But shifting gears just a little bit, what are some of your fears and concerns as a Muslim woman in the current climate? You're very visibly Muslim. You wear the hijab. You're out and about. You're a professional. What are some of the concerns that you have?
Well, I am concerned when I hear stories from my Muslim sisters who talk about walking down the street on their college campus and someone yelling at them, "Go back to your country," or yelling other slurs. That does concern me. I know it happens. And again, that's part of the sort of the normalization of hate that we're unfortunately experiencing. My family fears for my safety. I've changed sort of my approach to doing things. I tend to be a little bit more aware of my surroundings. I try not to go places by myself because I know that my presence could upset or bother someone. And so I have to always look out for my safety. And I encourage my Muslim sisters to do the same thing. But from a personal perspective, I don't let fear guide me. And I feel that when we do good work and we live good lives, that we're protected divinely. And I feel that there's no place in my heart or my mind. There's simply no space for concern other than a little bit of behavior modification.
But does that take its toll, though, the behavior modification? You say casually, but I mean, I'm wondering, having grown up here and now having to modify, certain parts of your behavior, everyday behavior, I mean, does that take a toll?
It does. I'll tell you that a couple of months ago, I was the subject of two very horrible articles that were written about me and my work. And it was really less about me as a person and more about just attacking institutions that I'm a part of, including Islam Berg. And that made me feel very unnerved. And I said, how could these authors who were men come at me, a woman, and how is that acceptable? But in this fight, everyone is fair game.
Absolutely.
So I made a decision that, okay, well, maybe next time I won't use these words. Maybe I won't say that. And then I said to myself, oh, but then they win because they censor me.
Sure.
And aren't we in an environment where we should never, ever as women feel that we are being censored? And so I've decided that they will not censor me and I will not be intimidated by it. And I've kept on.
That's amazing. And so you also are a mother to 7 children,
Yes.
ages 2 to 22,
Yes.
which is wonderful in itself. And
Thank you.
But in the current climate, I mean, how do you prepare your children to withstand some of the hateful rhetoric that they might be hearing in the news or just, in schools or around in the community? How do you prepare them to be resilient and withstand that?
Yes. In our household, the last few months have been very, very tough, especially at the height of some of the Republican rhetoric when all of the Republican candidates were still vying for top dog. And it seemed like getting there was all about stepping on the necks of the Muslim citizens in this country. You couldn't turn on the news without hearing it. And the children did become very traumatized by it. My 7-year-old particularly, my 9-year-old became very concerned about it. So what we had to do was talk about it in a constructive way and infuse their minds and their eardrums with stories of positive, righteous people and brave people throughout history who have been persecuted and who overcame, and continue to keep the children in an affirming environment. And that seems to have soothed them quite a bit.
Excellent. Well, Tahirah, we can go on for a very long time. This has been so informative. Thank you so much for your insights and your sort of advice to us as parents in the current climate as well. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me, and I appreciate you doing this service for your community and keeping the community informed on issues that are very, very important.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Until next time, this is your host, Mehlaka Samdani.